Welcome to Digging Deeper Ag Chats with Al. In today's episode, we're thrilled to be joined by Sally Murfet, founder of Inspired Ag and a specialist in what she calls human agronomy, the people side of farming. Sally brings a fresh perspective to agriculture, one that goes beyond paddocks and production and dives deep into what makes farming businesses thrive: people. Join us as we explore how investing in communication, culture and leadership on farm can improve not just workplace morale, but productivity and profitability. From managing energy and engagement to navigating succession, culture clashes and courageous conversations. This one's packed with insights for anyone working with or managing people in ag. So let's dig in. Welcome to Digging Deeper. Today we have a special guest, Sally Murfet, who's come all the way from Tasmania. How are you going, Sally?
I'm going super well. Thanks so much for having me.
It's our pleasure. Also got Jen Smith, who's the General Manager of the Gippsland Ag Group here, a special third person in the chair. Welcome, Jen.
Thanks, Al. Really excited to be in the studio today with Sally. She's just about to roll out a series of workshops across Gippsland, so it's great to hop in here and have a chat.
All right, well, we'll get stuck straight into it, Sally. Now, you've got some pretty unique skill sets when it comes to agriculture. It's one we probably won't expect, actually, a lot of us. You're in the business of farming people.
That sounds really bad, doesn't it? Yeah. No, not in the business of farming people, but I talk a lot about in my workshops and keynote presentations about human agronomy when it comes to farming. We talk a lot about to take the words of an American colleague, we talk about the weeds, breeds, seeds and feeds, but the human stuff, not so much. And, you know, my mission is to help farmers understand how humans can help drive business performance. Now, growing a lot of crops is a very complex task, but you say that your field or the field of human interaction is even more complicated. Would that be correct? Yeah, it can be. Yeah, I mean, we're all different and we're all unique in the way that we think, act and communicate. And so, you know, what I talk about a lot is that, you know, one is not better than the other. We're just different. And the sooner that we can get our heads around that and understand the differences and work together to achieve great outcomes, the better outcomes or the better outputs that we're going to get.
Yeah. Now, Jen, you look like you've got a question lined up.
So we often say people are our greatest asset, but we don't always treat them that way. You've worked with a lot of businesses. You've been around the traps and worked in this human agronomy space for a long time. In your view, what holds farm businesses back from really investing in people?
I think it's probably a deeper understanding of humans. A lot of people didn't go farming to deal with people. They went farming for the love of production or agriculture or whatever enterprise or commodity that they're dealing with. I think, you know, a lot of us haven't actually been led. You know, a lot of people have left. A lot of farmers in particular have left school. They've gone onto the farm. They've done their thing. They've worked their way up. Eventually taken over the reins from the family business, but haven't had that experience of being led by somebody else. And I think that's probably that's something that does hold us back as an industry. You know, when I'm talking with clients, what I will tell them, if they've got young ones coming back into the business after they've finished their ag college, I encourage them to go and get 5-10 years, well, not 10 years, but at least 5 years experience off farm, so they understand what it's like to have a good leader and what it's like to have a bad leader and the impact that can have on the individual. And once you've had that experience, I think you have a greater understanding of how humans can have a positive or negative impact on yourself and the individuals in it, but also the business.
So it's an interesting thing because my son's just started year 7 at school and everything's about leadership, how to be a good leader. But are you saying that we also need to practice being, say, a subordinate and seeing how we work within that?
Yeah, absolutely. Because, I mean, I don't know about you, but I've had some magnificent leaders throughout my career, but I've also had some very average and very ordinary ones. And the ones that have been quite ordinary have actually taught me a lot more about the type of leader that I want to be. And so, you know, having those experiences I think is invaluable, particularly if you, if you're of a size and scale where you need people in your business, understanding how to get the best out of yourself and also how to get the best out of others.
That's a good point. And even if we're not a bigger organisation, we're going to be dealing with lots of people. So being able to lead and be a subordinate at the same time is going to be a big part of anyone's farming operation, I guess. So,
Yep.
There's a concept I've heard you talk about, and it's called the resignation ripple. Can you talk us through that a little bit?
The Great Resignation, is that the one?
Quite possibly.
Yeah. So I'll talk a lot about the Great Resignation. It's a trend that's playing out in the US. It's been studied by an organisation called Gallup. They're a global human performance organisation. And the Great Resignation is essentially something that's happened as a result of the pandemic. You know, people are having a second thought about, you know, what really motivates them, what gets them out of bed every morning. And what they're doing is they're taking demotions, they're taking pay cuts, or they're quitting their jobs altogether, all in order to get some sort of balance back into their life, because they've been through the pandemic and gone, this is not what I want out of life. I don't want to be working 60, 70, 80 hours a week. I don't want to be leading people. I don't want to be managing those sort of budgets. And so this is a global phenomenon that I think we really need to be considerate of in agriculture. And I think we're starting to see that in some respects flow into the labour market here in Australia now in agriculture.
Yeah. So how do we start to manage that better or start to navigate through that?
Well, it's about understanding what motivates people at the end of the day, like understanding whether your people are intrinsically motivated or whether they're extrinsically motivated. So if they're intrinsically motivated, they're going to be motivated for personal reasons to do things because they want to do a good job, or they've got a purpose of some sort. If they're extrinsically motivated, then they're doing it for the paycheck or the recognition or the notoriety of doing a role. So understanding what makes people tick is a really important part of Australian agriculture's ability to attract, develop and retain people into this business.
So losing people from our business and getting that new hire has been quoted at a cost of about $20,000, you know, to each of our businesses. Through your work with Inspired Ag, what have you seen that makes up that cost, that resignation cost and that rehiring cost?
Yeah, so when I do presentations for Inspire Ag, I always talk about employee engagement, and that's where the figure of $20,000 has come in. It's about 18 to 24, depending on which data source you look at. But basically, like if you've got an engaged employee, somebody that is really motivated intrinsically, wants to come to work, wants to do the job, they're often the first people in the gate of a morning, typically the last to go of an evening, and they will always do more than what is expected of them. Whereas if you have a disengaged employee, these are the sort of, if you can imagine like a floor or a ceiling, if you like, and that's the minimum standard. Like a disengaged employee will just do enough to stay off the boss's radar. And so the difference between a disengaged employee and an engaged employee is said to be $18,000 to $24,000. So if you have to replace a disengaged employee and bring a new person in that's engaged and motivated, you know, it's not just the time to recruit, but which is typically a lot of the data is saying about 80 days. In agriculture, I think that's much more like 100, 120 days. It's a really long lead time. So, you know, if you've got somebody that's resigned and left the business, you've got a gap there that you've got to fill somehow, you know, bringing in some casual labour or taking up the slack yourself. And then so by the time you bring that person in, recruit them, induct them, get them in the business, get them rolling, you know, it's that $18,000 to $24,000 of the actual salary that you're recruiting for.
Yeah, okay. And how should farm managers or business owners respond when they sense someone is disengaging in their business?
Have a simple conversation. I'll give you a practical example of that. I had a client about probably 4 years ago now in South Australia, called me, had a big long list of problems that they had in their business, had an amazing team, but they just had all these little things that kept on coming up. And you know, when I went into the business and found out what was going on from their perspective and also from the employee's perspective, you know, there was some tiny things that just kept on, you know, like thorns in the side or, you know, a splinter or something like that just kept irritating. And after that consultation, I actually encouraged the client to have a conversation, start engaging with the employee, because the employee divulged something to me that he asked me not to say anything to the client, but if they had just said it directly to the client, and they did eventually do that. And what they found out was that that particular individual had some pretty significant challenges in the mental health space. And what they were asking this individual to do, like they were changing irrigation rosters. So they were bringing in like a night shift into their irrigation. And the employee didn't want to do that and was causing all sorts of problems because his medication, he had to have his medication at 8 o'clock of an evening, and he was completely...
Wipe him out, would it?
And wipe him out for the rest of the evening until the next morning. And so he wanted to be there in the business, but he didn't know how to have that conversation. And if there'd been some more opportunities for the client or the employer to have some conversations, could have solved a lot of drama in the business.
So it sounds almost like we've got to create a culture where that two-way communication is quite acceptable, and so maybe that employee then would have had a pathway to chat to the employer before it got to that stage.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah.
You also talk about family, work versus workplace culture. Now, I don't know the statistics, but I'm sure it's very high of family-run businesses, especially up here in Gippsland. Are there major differences or big differences between a family-run business and a non-family-run business?
Typically, that's a dedicated HR unit. Generally, like if they're of the size or scale where they do actually warrant having that HR unit in there. But I talk when I talk to clients, I always encourage them to think about culture, because culture is essentially it's what you believe, how you make decisions, and how you behave in the business. And so if you created a culture, your perspective of a culture, and said, oh, this is a fantastic place to work, well, you as an employer, you're not actually the owner of that culture. Your people are the owners of the culture. And so if you're saying that you're one culture and your employees are thinking that perhaps you're not what you're portraying to be, there's obviously a big contradiction there. And so, having a values-based business, I think, is really important. A lot of my clients think that's soft and fluffy. And by the time I finished with them, they're like, yep, I'm glad you got us to get through this, because we now understand how that actually drives performance. Because, if you've got a culture of honesty and integrity, or people first, and you don't display that has a really significant impact on your people, for a start. Your ability to attract and retain talent from into the sector or into the business. But I think it's really important, having a values-based business is understanding how you operationalise your values. So, it's not just a sign up on the smoko room wall that says, we value trust and honesty, integrity, respect, all of that sort of stuff. But it's how you actually play that out. So, I get my clients to sit down and talk to their team about what that actually means. What would it actually look like if we were being honest with each other? And that they work through.
We're not starting to role play here, are we?
No, we're not going to. No. I don't like role play, so I'm not going to make you do it. But if as a farming business, if you sit down and say, okay, well, our value is honesty, and yeah, so you figure out some ways of how you operationalize that, and that is, that we can have conversations with each other even if they're difficult. That's how honesty shows up in our business as a value. Yeah. So as I said, it's all good to have it soft and fluffy, but unless you've actually got it operationalized and everyone knows what that looks like, that's what a values-based driven business looks like from my perspective.
So you do most of your work with teams under 10, so those businesses that can't necessarily employ a dedicated HR unit, and often the owners and the managers are a husband and wife team, and those business operators are noted for being some of the most efficient farmers in the world. Those family-run teams, when they're running well, that focus on farm productivity, whether we're talking about the animals or we're talking about the pasture, getting that productivity. And you talk a lot about the most valuable thing in a productivity sense, and it isn't what we expect. You spoke about managing energy levels. Why is that so powerful, and what does that have to do with productivity on the farm?
Energy levels in terms of how you're showing up for your team. That's what I talk about. So there was some research done. Actually, I can't think who it was off the top of my head, but the research said that a manager is responsible for 70% variance in team engagement. So, as farmers, if there's something going wrong in our production system that's having a 70% impact, positive or negative, if it's negative, we're going to be doing something about that, aren't we? So from that perspective, it's about, as a leader, how you show up for your team. Like if you're showing up in a huffy, gruffy mood and you're giving a really negative energy, guess what's going to happen to the team? Like your team are going to perform to that level, and they're always going to be looking over their shoulder, worried about what's the boss going to do next, or how am I going to navigate today just to make sure I can get through it. So that's what I talk about in terms of energy. Being really conscious of the energy being aware of the energy that you're bringing to the team is really important.
Now, I get grumpy at times. What are some practical things we can actually do for ourselves to get ourselves out of that mindset before we, say, rock up to work and upset everyone else?
Yeah. Look, it's really personal. I can give you some examples of what clients of mine doing, like other, yoga and meditation and all those sort of things to make sure that they're in that right mindset moving in. But also some other really practical aspects, like, if you need to have a really difficult conversation and the weather is not there, it's probably something that you shouldn't be doing that day. So, giving yourself that space or grace to go, okay, I need to have this conversation. Now is not the right time to do it. Can I sleep on this? Can I, never do something when you're tired, never do something when you're hungry. So it's really important that you understand yourself and your own triggers. You're responsible as a leader for your own triggers and managing those.
What's your thoughts on time away from farm or time off farm? Is that a fairly important part of what you believe farmers should be doing?
Yeah, absolutely. We are, as much as people will disagree with this comment, we are not our farms. And so figuring out, particularly if you're sort of getting to the, that midsection of your career and understanding what might be next for you, and you've got a generation coming through, figuring out who you are outside of the farm is actually something that's really important. So being involved with community or sports or, other ventures that are not specifically farming or agricultural based is just so super important. A lot of when I'm working with clients in the succession space, usually the conflict or the tension comes in because mum and dad don't actually know who they are outside the farm. And that's not a criticism, it's just that they've put so much blood, sweat and tears into the business, and they just haven't had that time or space to do so. So absolutely it's important, and I really encourage people to prioritise that.
And just on that, if we're thinking about trying to develop an identity outside of our farm and the lack of identity outside of our farm being a blocker to succession planning, what other blockers come alongside that in preventing that farm succeeding well?
The illusion that communication has happened.
Say more.
That's very Brene Brown of you. To lean on the Brene Brown stuff, clear is kind. A lot of people haven't had those conversations specifically about what the future looks like. And so being able to sit down as a family unit and understand, particularly when conflict comes in, sort of digress a little bit, but often I work with businesses, as I said before, that are not of that size or scale where they require a dedicated HR resource. More often than not, they're husband and wife partners, like they're business partners and life partners. And often that tension will come in because there's no escape from these conversations or conflicts. And so when I've got a client who's in that space where there is conflict, what I encourage them to do is, if it's something that's happening, they can't make a decision or there's tension around it, I encourage them to say, are you asking me this question as your wife or your husband, or are you asking me this as your business partner? So you get that that distinction between the two roles. And often when they can make that distinction between, how they're actually framing up the question and what way they're asking it, the tension disappears. I'll give you a practical example of that. I had a client in Western Australia recently who they had an employee. The husband wanted to keep the employee and was arguing his perspective about there were some things going wrong, but he wanted to fix it and keep the employee. The wife was responding to the situation from the perspective of, things are happening, we need to get this person out of our business. And so they were coming from two completely different perspectives. And one of the frameworks that I offer up is a GROW framework, not specifically agricultural growth, but, when you're in those sort of situations, you ask yourself, what is the goal of this conversation? So that's your G. Then you ask yourself, what is the reality of this current situation? What are the opportunities? And then what are the way forward? And so when I sat down with that client and I said to him, okay, what is the goal of this conversation? They gave their both perspectives and they go, oh, wow, we've both been completely going at this bull at a gate from our own little bubble and our perspectives, and we just haven't been hearing each other. And so the tension's there because we haven't been actually arguing about the same thing. We've been arguing about the same situation, but our perspectives were completely different on it.
Mm.
As someone who's been married for 17 years and farming in business with that same person for 17 years, I find that quite relatable. Can you give me some practical tips, though, in terms of how I separate myself as a wife and myself as a business partner in our farming system?
Yeah. I mean, it sounds very, very corporate, but simply having job descriptions, understanding, what is the role and responsibility of each person, and just sitting down and nutting that out. And you'd be surprised at how many people go, wow, we've actually been stepping on each other's toes throughout our whole business journey and not even realizing it, because, I thought that was your role, but it's actually my role, and vice versa. So just something as simple as doing that. Having a values-based business, I think, is really important. We spoke about that before. And understanding the communication and behaviour style of each person that's, whether it's a husband and wife partnership, whether it's a business partnership or your team, understanding the differences is really important, because, some of us are really, I talk a lot about the DISC model. So you got your dominance, influence, your steadiness, and your compliance personalities or behaviour styles. And often you'll find when I test the husband and wife, what you'll find is one is a dominant and one is an influence. So they're completely opposite ends of the spectrum. And I'm not saying one is better than the other, but what I am advocating is that as an industry, understanding behaviour and communication styles is really important to drive productivity, because we're all unique. We're all different. We don't want a whole team of Ds and we don't want a whole team of Is, for example. Those differences actually bring a unique perspective and focus in the way that we make decisions and the way that we lead our teams.
So if someone is feeling stuck with people management, where's a good place to start?
Having an honest conversation about it, just acknowledging that there is a problem. That is often the first part and probably the hardest part. And once you've got past that, everything else becomes a little bit more easy to navigate. But just acknowledging that there is a challenge in the first place.
I used to be a school teacher, and the principal used to bang on about courageous conversations. And I think sometimes we've got to start that courageous conversation.
Yeah.
Because it is actually quite a hard step sometimes. But once you do get over that hump, things do often become a bit easier. You touched on, and then you did digress a little bit, succession planning. Now, I'm guessing you digressed because it's such a difficult topic. You don't want to talk about it?
No, not at all. Not at all.
Okay, well, let's talk about it a little bit. Firstly, a quick question. Have you ever seen a smooth one?
No.
No. Didn't think so, but I was hopeful. When we do start the topic of succession, what are some key things that you think, I guess, need to be sort of a focus early days?
Understanding the people that are involved in that dynamic. Understanding how they make decisions, understanding how they communicate, understanding how they show up within the business. as I said before, similar to the disc style, we all show up in different ways, but just understanding what actually makes up that business and learning to have those respectful conversations is really important early up, because I think that is the key component of where succession goes wrong, is we just don't know how to communicate with each other. And a lot of younger people that I work with, for example, they say that they want succession to happen, and when you sit down with them and go, okay, what does that look like? Paint me a picture. A lot of them actually can't tell you or can't illustrate what that looks like. They haven't done the work to sit down and understand, well, what does the business structure look like? Who's involved? How do we navigate on-farm, off-farm family? And they just haven't had those rigid conversations around succession, and that's where it goes pear-shaped, because they haven't taken the time to understand how to communicate with each other, but they also haven't valued the relationship component of succession, and the relationship is everything.
Now, you can do a personal plug here if you like, would you always advocate to get a third party involved in succession?
100%. And I'm not saying that because I operate in the leadership and team development and succession space. I'm saying that because I have been through this with my own family. Like, we had some conversations about 2 years ago, a family farm on the northwest coast of Tassie. We sat down, we're 4 siblings, we get on super well. And the moment we started talking about stuff like, we started the conversation about family health wishes and stuff like that. And the conversation went south really quickly. As strong as we are as a family unit, when emotion gets involved, that can often be the factor that makes those sort of conversations go pear-shaped. And so having somebody that's not emotionally involved in that conversation to lead the family, I think, is just paramount.
What is your business called for listeners?
So my business is Inspire Ag, and tagline is Powering Agri People.
Powering Agri People. All right, well, we're just about out of time, but could you just give us one piece of advice you'd like every Gippsland farmer to hear before we close this afternoon?
That's a really, really good question. One piece of advice that I'd like Gippsland farmers to know. I think my piece of advice is valuing the whole person and not just the part that makes you money.
Good one. Now, the questions don't get any easier, because our signature question is, what is something you have learnt recently that has surprised you?
I recently learnt that that employees are actually 10.4 times more likely to leave a bad culture than they are for money reasons. And my mind was blown by that. Like, I knew the fact, I knew it was significant, but I just didn't realise how significant that was. 10.4, like, that's insane.
The big one. Jen, anything else before we sign off?
No, thanks for joining us, Sally, and really looking forward to hosting you in Gippsland this week.
Lovely. Thanks very much for having me along. It's been great.
No worries. We'll see you all next week, listeners. A big thank you for tuning in today. And remember, if you have a question about today's episode or a topic you'd like us to cover, reach out to one of our many platforms and join the conversation. We're here because of your passion and commitment to agriculture. Together, we can build a stronger farming future.
This podcast is made possible by the Future Drought Fund Regional Drought Resilience Planning Program, co-funded by the Victorian and Australian governments.